Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another writing video. So today I'm going to be talking about how to overcome perfectionism in your writing. I find that a lot of writers describe themselves as perfectionists, and I wouldn't say that I'm a perfectionist like in all areas of my life. I definitely am with my writing. I can think of times where after a piece of mine was published, I looked back at it and found a typo or a sentence or that I didn't like or a repeated word, and it almost feels like it just taints the entire piece. Anytime someone reads it, I'm like, oh god, they probably think that it's ruined and terrible because of that one thing. And I can find that one thing that I don't like in pretty much every story that I've ever published. There's something that I don't like about it. And I think that anytime someone reads it, they probably just fixate on that and think I'm a terrible writer when probably they literally didn't even care. Know what it feels like to be a perfectionist about your writing and feel like there's this standard of perfection that if you don't meet it, anything below it is bad, right? It's perfect or it's bad. That's such a unrealistic binary to put yourself in, especially because you probably don't feel that way about the stuff that you read. I definitely don't feel that way about the stuff that I read, but it's easy to apply it to your own writing. So today I wanted to talk about some things to keep in mind to help overcome or get past perfectionism in your writing. There's obviously no quick fix for this. It's not like an easy thing to just overcome if it's a tendency you have or struggle with, but I hope that this video will be helpful. Number one, stop nitpicking everything you read. This is like the CinemaSins effect, right? Where if I can go through something and find a bunch of little things that don't make sense, then it's bad. I think that the strength of a work is in what it accomplishes holistically. If you have a beautiful book or a beautiful film or whatever, if there's a couple little errors, does it really matter? And I think that the gentler you are with the media you consume, you don't care if you find a typo. This is something that I find ridiculous. Like, people will act like if a book has a couple typos, then it's a bad book. And like, yes, if a book has tons of errors to the point that it's hard to read or it just looks sloppy and wasn't well edited, yes, I think that that's a problem. But do you know how hard it is to remove every single typo from a book? Like, it's so hard. I'm a really bad proofreader. I've published 13 stories, something around that. And I don't know if I've ever published one without a single error. You can do dozens of drafts and there will still be typos. The gentler you are with stuff you read, where it's like, okay, yeah, there was a typo, that didn't ruin my reading experience. What was actually important in the story was the characters in the story. Tiny little mistakes, this little thing that maybe doesn't make sense, this one sentence that was kind of awkward. It drives me off the wall when I see like people complain about like a single sentence in a book that maybe was confusing or overwrought or felt like it was trying too hard, and use that one sentence as an example for why the book was like overwritten or terrible. And it's like, okay, most books are gonna have one sentence or several sentences that are, kind of awkward or trying too hard. And once we stop applying this wild standard of in every single word and every single sentence needs to be absolutely perfect to what we read, then we can be gentler with ourselves as well. And I think how you read and the grace that you give other writers impacts how you interact with your own work. Allow other writers to make mistakes and still see their works as beautiful and things that gave value to your life. When I read a book, does it give value to me because there were 0 typographical errors? No. If a book brings value to me, it's probably because I connected to the story or the characters, and a few little mistakes, whether in the technical writing or even in the story itself, honestly don't really take away from that. Number two, accept that a work is done when you feel at peace with it rather than when it's perfect. I think it's very easy to see your work where it's like, if there's one tiny mistake, it's ruined entirely. Do you know how long novels are? They're so long. They take so long to write. They take so much work to edit. It is impossible to write a perfect novel. This is something I really struggled with because for a long time I wrote short fiction. I have a background in short fiction. I still do write short fiction. But there was a period of time where I only wrote short stories and I got really into them. Then I started trying to write a novel and I was like, why is this so hard and so bad? And I didn't know what that was. And then eventually I had a guest speaker in a university class. She perfectly put into words what I was feeling. And she was like, writing novels when you come from a short story background is really hard because you can kind of write a perfect short story, Perfect not in the sense that everyone ever will love it, but every single word is there with purpose and intention. There is nothing extraneous and everything contributes to the whole. And the shorter the work is, the easier it is to achieve that level. And you cannot write a perfect novel. It is simply impossible. It really cannot be done. Novels are inherently messy, and that is what makes them beautiful. As a writer of both short fiction and novels, what I think makes novels beautiful is that they can never be perfect, and they will be messy, and you will have little threads that maybe never come back. And little thoughts and little tangents, and that's kind of what makes them beautiful. Short stories can be beautiful for another reason, where, you know, that satisfaction of having every single word and every single sentence in place is extremely satisfying. Even writing a short story where everything is perfect and there are no flaws is extremely difficult and extremely rare. So I think that instead of trying to feel that a piece is done when it is perfect, get to a point where you feel that your pieces are done when you feel content with it. When you reach this point of contentment where it's like, okay, this is saying what I wanted it to say and it's doing what I wanted it to do. And, you know, perfection is maybe counterproductive. I remember reading, and I wish I could remember where this was. It was an article or it was a Twitter thread. I don't even remember. But it was someone who was on a board of a literary magazine and was saying that a lot of the pieces that the magazine would publish were actually kind of dull, uninspired pieces, but that's because they didn't really take risks, so they essentially had nothing wrong with them. They were perfect, but they were just kind of uninspiring. But there was nothing wrong with them, and so the editors were like, well, there's nothing wrong with this, let's publish it. On the other hand, this person was talking about how a lot of really inventive, exciting pieces that took a lot of risks were not getting to the late stages of the editorial process, or were getting to the late stages of the editorial process and then were getting rejected, because even though they were more exciting and thrilling to read, because they took more risks and they were more complex, idealistically, they had more room for error. And so judging things based on what's perfect, aka what has no errors, doesn't actually always result in the best work. Sometimes what is on paper perfect is kind of dull or kind of uninspired or doesn't take risks or isn't complex enough. You know, I talk about this in a lot of videos where I talk about character. People are messy. A perfectly written character where like every single detail that is mentioned about the character perfectly ties back in and everything about them is explained doesn't actually sound like a real person. That sounds like a fake person because people are way too messy for that. That's what makes people interesting and that's what makes story interesting. And sometimes those nuances maybe would be dings on the perfection of a work, but they might actually make the work better. Like, I know it's so cheesy. Oh my god, the imperfections are what makes it special. But like, literally, sometimes it's true. I'm not a painter, but let's say that I wanted to do the perfect painting. What if I just took a canvas and painted it a pure solid color? Well, I could say, well, what can you find wrong with it? You know, there are no mistakes in technique, no poor proportioning. It's just a perfect representation of what it is. It's a perfect representation of the color green. Maybe you can't find flaws in it, but it's literally just a board painted green. Painting that maybe has a couple little that maybe has some technical mistakes, but is a beautiful, complex scene. That's the better painting than me, who doesn't know how to paint, painting a perfect representation of green. If you feel at peace with a work and you're like, this is doing what I want it to do, who cares if it's perfect? You're content with it, and that's what matters. I really realize how much I'm starting to repeat myself, because the next point I had here is there's no such thing as a perfect novel, which I've already talked about in much depth. The next point, also one that I've kind of already talked about, is that flaws actually don't make a work inherently bad. A lot of my favorite books have flaws. Oh well. Did I love reading them? Did they move me? Did I feel affected? Did I feel immersed? That's what I care about as a reader. A couple flaws, literally meaningless. A lot of my favorite books that I gave 5-star ratings, rave about, they're my favorite books, maybe objectively have flaws. Maybe sometimes even larger flaws than just tiny little mistakes. I literally don't care. Like, it doesn't matter. I loved those books. Not everyone is going to love every book. Writing a book that everyone loves is literally impossible. Once you have a readership beyond your friends and family, finished, complete, maybe even amazing work isn't equivalent to a work that is unflawed. The next point that I wanted to talk about is kind of related, and it's that a book or any work doesn't have to do every single thing perfectly to be good. Most books that are my favorite books, I love them because they do one or two things amazingly. They do one or two things so beautifully. Other aspects of the story may kind of fall to the wayside. You know, it's not like every single book that I love has amazing, perfect pacing and extremely deep characterization and perfect dialogue and amazing description. Like, every book shines for different reasons. The focus is on different elements with every book, and also just every writer has different places that they shine. In those books where, you know, one or two aspects are so beautifully done, like, that's what draws me in. It doesn't matter if some craft elements are kind of to the background. It doesn't really matter because you're focused on what's shine so much, right? Like, not every book needs to be a 10 out of 10 in every single category. The final tip that I have for overcoming perfectionism is use perfectionism to fuel you, and then trust it. If you're a perfectionist, learn to trust that. When you've worked so hard on a piece, you've done so many drafts, you've put so much care into everything, that means you've put an immense amount of work and care into the piece, and that's better probably than someone who doesn't really care and is kind of lazy and just throws something together. Trust your perfectionism for what it can do for you as a writer, and then once you're done the piece, let perfectionism fuel you and see that that can actually bring amazing results. Key thing is learning when to let it go, right? If you get caught in a loop of perfectionism that never ends, you'll just over-edit a piece and never move on. When you get to that point of contentment with the piece, let go and trust the work and think, you know what? The fact that I care so much, and I'm a perfectionist because I care so much about it and I want it to be as good as possible, means that I put as much as I possibly can into this work, and I can kind of just trust that, and I can let that go. Like, learn to, once you've finished a piece, trust those perfectionistic instincts. Because I know for me, I tend to, once I'm finished something, start to think it's not very good. I don't like to read my stuff once it's done, or especially once it's published, because you can't change it at that point. And if I find mistakes, it kind of sours how I feel about the whole piece, which sucks, and I'm trying to get better at that. I cannot tell you how many times I've published a story, and then the day it was published, went to go read it, found a mistake. It happens to me like pretty much every time, and it's why I've stopped reading my stuff after it's published. It's easy to forget how much work you put into something and feel like, oh, it's old, it's probably not very good. Trust that that perfectionism served you in the past, and learn to just move on from your old work once it's done. So that's all for this video. Perfectionism can often hold writers back, but it can also be something to help fuel you forward and help you create amazing work. You just have to learn to not get caught up in it and actually kind of trust it as something that brought a lot of good to your process. Once you get to the point where you no longer need that, being able to move on. So that's all for today's video. If you feel like dealing with perfectionism has hindered you in your writing, I would love to hear what has helped you deal with that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!